Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Daily Defender. Great to be with all you guys again. Glad we're able to get another video out and get some new content out. So great to be with everybody again. The usual admin, although I'm taking a little different approach today because it's actually on my shirt. Please continue to subscribe to the channel. And by the way, this is a very nice gift from my wife over the holidays. But as like I always say, we need a ton of subscribers on YouTube to really do anything with the channel and move it forward. So first, thank you for all of the subscribers that we already have. I really appreciate all you folks. Please continue to subscribe. If you like the content, please continue to do so. Thanks for the comments and likes. Again, we had some really nice comments recently on the 4006 and also some comments on the H&K videos I did. You guys probably saw that I've kind of interjected with another brand, the H&K brand. If you haven't seen those few videos, check them out. I'm going to do more on H&K because it's really another favored brand of mine. But today, as you can tell, I couldn't stay away from revolvers, and I couldn't really stay away from snub-nose revolvers apparently very long, because today on the table we have this beautiful Smith & Wesson. This particular model is a 30-1. And so while maybe it appears or looks like a Chief Special in 38 Special, it is not. It's chambered in 32 Smith & Wesson long. And we'll get into that a little bit in the deep dive because this particular caliber and this style pistol has kind of fascinated me for a while now. I think it's really, really interesting. Again, it goes pretty deep, if not almost starting with Smith & Wesson history in terms of the calibers that they were experimenting with their early hand ejectors and some even their very, very early firearms like the top brakes, minus a 22 rim fire. It was really 32. It was a 32 Smith & Wesson cartridge, basically a 32 Smith & Wesson short is what it was, that they started with in the very, very early days of Smith & Wesson, which I think is really cool. And so that's why this caliber, this 32 Smith & Wesson, whether it's short or long, has really kind of fascinated me. And this particular pistol had been in the shop for a number of weeks. And it really was a very, very good price. It was considerably better than what I was seeing online. And in deep dive, we'll take a closer look at it and have some fun with it. Taking a look at all kinds of neat little things about it. But I really wanted to talk about it with you guys today. It's again, a kind of a really exciting firearm for me in terms of its history and that in this caliber, this 32 Smith & Wesson long. So without dragging on our intro, let's get right into the deep dive on our 30-1. Right, so as I just introduced, I want to take a deep dive and a really nice look at what I think is a really pretty handgun, a beautiful handgun that Smith & Wesson made. And this happens to be the 30-1, like I mentioned, chambered in 32 Smith & Wesson long. And as I also mentioned, you'd be easily mistaken, or you could be mistaken if you thought this was a Chief Special in 38 Special because it's built on a J-frame. So there's a lot of similarities to that Chief Special, and we'll get into that. But one of the things that really intrigues me about this particular firearm is the caliber. The 32 Smith & Wesson long harks back to actually just a 32 Smith & Wesson, which is also called a 32 Smith & Wesson short. And that's intriguing to me because it's really one of the staple calibers that Smith & Wesson was using with their firearms. Shortly after they started the company, right? We know they started in 1852, and in these late 1800s or through 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they're spending a lot of time with this 32 Smith & Wesson cartridge. And in fact, the 32, the top brakes, very, very similar to this firearm, and all these firearms are loaded that we have on the table, right? They always are. We always pre-check everything before the video, but we'll show you that. And this one is the same. But this is a 32 safety hammerless in 32 Smith & Wesson short, and you can kind of already see how much shorter that's going to be. Now the cylinder's a little different here for the J-frame, but you get a feel for what Smith & Wesson was doing in the late 1800s. or mid-1800s all the way through the early 1900s. This particular example is probably in 1902 to 1909, somewhere in that time frame. But again, this staple 32 Smith & Wesson cartridge is really what Smith & Wesson is using. And they continue to explore that 32 cartridge. And in the late 1800s, right before the turn of the century, Smith & Wesson, again, clear and safe, brings out a 32 hand ejector. Now, it had been very similar to this. This is actually my Regulation Police in 38 Smith & Wesson, but it's still on an I-frame. And that's what Smith & Wesson brought out in this 1895, 1896 time frame. It's a 32 hand ejector on an I-frame, but in 32 Smith & Wesson long. So the cartridge evolves, and they move to 32 Smith & Wesson long. And that's also very interesting, or there's another interesting point to this, because this 32 hand ejector becomes the first firearm that as I understand it, that an American police department acquired. And it was either up in New York or New Jersey, I don't remember exactly. And then I think there was a department in Pennsylvania that followed quickly thereafter. So again, we just have some really, really nice Smith & Wesson history, American history, and even law enforcement history with this 32 cartridge. And what does that cartridge look like? I always find this interesting and fascinating, so hopefully you guys do as well. This is actually a 32 Smith & Wesson, or 30 short, and this is a 32 Smith & Wesson long. So you can, and one's a wad cutter, so I apologize, it throws off the image a little bit, but you can see the difference there between the two cartridges. So the cartridge evolved. And just put a little bit more perspective to it, this is a 38 Smith & Wesson, and this is a 38 Special. So when you hear people talk about 32s and 38s and 38 shorts, or 32 shorts and 32 longs and all of this, that's what these cartridges look like. And so yeah, that's the evolution of this into this 32 long. But again, it's built off the I-frame, and they continue with this I-frame all the way through into the 50s. When Smith & Wesson decides that they want to move from the I-frame to, I think it's the improved I-frame, and eventually to a J-frame, which is what we have here. And again, you could be pardoned for thinking that was a 32 Smith & Wesson. I'm sorry, a Chief Special and 38 Special, which we have here as a clear and safe firearm, because you can tell they're very, very similar, aren't they? Kind of get that on camera correctly. If you're just looking down on the case pretty quickly, you'd be hard pressed to pick up that the 30-1 is a 32 cartridge, and opposed to the 38 Special. And we'll come back to this, but I thought you guys might like to see those comparisons. So again, fast forwarding or getting up to this 1950s range, and we get into the J frame, and specifically, as some of you know, or most of you know, that in 1957, Smith & Wesson starts issuing model numbers. So they move away from the term of just a firearm name, where 32 hand ejector or Regulation Police like this one is, and we actually move to model numbers. And so this 32 hand ejector becomes the Model 30, and it becomes the Model 30 in 1957. In 1961, I believe, had to get my head straight there, they introduce the next evolution, as they do with their engineering design changes, and it becomes a 30-1. And they produce this pistol from 61, and then it stops in 76. And Smith & Wesson decides they're not going to produce the 30s anymore, and the 32 Smith & Wesson long cartridge. There may have been some other models that they kept longer than that. I'd have to go back and do research on that. But on this 32 hand ejector, which we talked about starting in 1896 or so, effectively, sadly, kind of ends in 1976. And this particular model that we have on the table, and we can kind of start to get into the deep dive a little bit, really pretty gun. This one is probably in a, what were my memory notes on this, but somewhere between a 66 and a 69. So again, the 30-1 started in 61, ended in 1976, and this model is somewhere between a 66 and a 69. I know that for a couple reasons. One, again, the serial number, which would have or is on the base of the frame if we took the stocks off, does not have an H in the serial number prefix. And my understanding is that started around 69 or 70. And also we have what we call the traditional latch. They would have started in the 50s and 60s with the Model 30 and then the 30-1. They would have started with some type of flat latch. And maybe while we're on that topic, if you're interested, I'm not sure I've ever really gone into this level of detail. Smith & Wesson used 3 different latches, this being the most traditional and what was used, again, from, call it the mid 60s on, probably, depending on which model we're talking about. But previous to that, they had a couple different thumb latches, 3 in total, and this was one of the flat latches, and then there was another version to the flat latch. So, but again, it helps us identify the timing, or the year of this particular firearm. So if we kind of do our continuous kind of walk around like we always did, and again with clear and safe firearm, we'll kind of take a look at all the neat little features to this. Obviously, it's a blued gun, and as you guys know, I'm kind of just intoxicated with the way Smith & Wesson did the bluing, and really does still do a nice job today. But they're bluing this midnight blue, to me, is just always gorgeous, and this is another firearm that didn't disappoint. But if we just kind of walk around it as we usually do, we have Smith & Wesson roll stamped here in the left side of the barrel, and as we kind of walk just around it, we've got on our frame, we've got the Smith & Wesson trademark logo on this side. If we turn the pistol around, we have what is very traditional at this time, the Smith & Wesson information here stamped at the bottom of the frame, and then we have the cartridge stamped at the top of or on the right side of the barrel, and it does state, I know that's pretty hard to see. See if we can get it to focus. 32 Smith & Wesson long. So it's stated right there on the barrel, and I think that's always pretty cool. I always like to see the cartridge information stamped on the barrel. We have a pin barrel, so we're still doing that. This particular firearm is made in that era where Smith & Wesson was still pinning barrels. It has the hammer nose, so we see that there. And again, we already talked about the traditional latch. And what else can I tell you about it? It has, of course, the traditional J-frame, and it is a J-frame, notched, or I should say trench sight with it's kind of this rear notch on the back, and then a serrated front sight, and it is the very thin front sight. I actually shot this firearm side by side to my Model 60, which is a stainless steel J-frame of a 80s vintage, I believe, and it was noticeably different picking up that front sight. Much more difficult on the older Smith. The sight is thinner, and it's just that much more difficult to pick up, at least at my eyes, at my age, opposed to some of the newer, if you will, front sights that are wider. And so it's noticeable. I definitely notice the difference. The hammer is a narrow, what they call a narrow hammer, and of course it's serrated. And the trigger is a serrated trigger. Smith's either came with generally smooth or serrated triggers. I think generally these groove triggers, I guess, is better than serrated, but these groove triggers were, again, more towards earlier firearms. And if we look closely enough, and again, we'll see if we can get the camera to focus on that. Maybe not. It does state 30-1. There we go. You might be a mod 30-1. So, and it is a 6-shot. So it's still a 6-shot revolver, but again in 32 Smith & Wesson long. But it has that. It has, obviously, as I said, it has a J-frame, so it has this J-frame feel. It's an all-steel gun. What is a little interesting on this firearm is the stocks. These were Harrod, I believe I was told in the shop. And, traditionally this firearm would have been supplied with something very similar to this, right? What we would have found on the J-frame Chief Special, these walnut Magnus stocks, either with or without a diamond pattern. So this would have been the traditional stock that would have been on this firearm. Whoever owned this has taken that off. A little unfortunate. And I'll probably find an original set to put on there, just because this firearm does go back to that mid 60s range. But I will say, this is, as we've talked about in some other videos, this is an extremely comfortable and still a very nice wood grip, right? There's some really nice grain in here. This is very well done on both sides of the grip, or stock, I should say. They're in excellent shape. There's a small chip up here at the top, but beyond that, at first I was like, okay, I can change out the stocks, but really it's extremely comfortable to hold and shoot. They're very, very, very nice. And we talk again a lot on this channel of the Smith & Wesson revolvers, and just the amount of people that take wood stocks off or put on grip adapters, because really these are not the most comfortable grips in the world in terms of shooting. You can hold on to it, and it's a nice little fit, and it's great for concealed carry, and they're beautiful, right? These are original walnut stocks that came with this 38 Special. Just beautiful, beautiful wood, but from a true purchase on the firearm, not the best. And there's all kinds of comments and discussions about those, and people changing stocks, and that's why as you move on into the other later years, the 80s and 90s and all that, you find all of the Pachmayr rubber grips, etc., because they're all trying to duplicate some kind of better grip and purchase on the firearms. So, but I think that was really what I wanted to talk with you guys about. We've done so many different videos on Smith & Wesson snub nose that I think a lot of the base information has been covered. But this 32 Smith & Wesson cartridge was just really, really neat, really, really appealing to me because of the history. How did it shoot, and did I like the firearm? Absolutely. I mean, again, the feel and weight was exactly like any other J-frame. I mentioned I shot it side by side with the Model 60. I found the triggers to be very, very similar. The trigger, if you're interested with this Chief Special that I have, I'm going to try to maybe remember what date this was. I want to say 50, what was this one? I think this was also an early 60s. Yeah, this was like a 62 or 63. And we think this one is somewhere between 66 and 69. And I'll say that the triggers, dry firing them was almost identical. But the 32 Smith & Wesson long cartridge, how did it shoot? It's just very, very palatable, right? As you might imagine, it's a very, very light cartridge. Almost 22 like. It did not have, because I shot them side by side, and obviously a 38 Special is not a difficult cartridge to shoot either. It did not have anywhere near like the little pop that you got with a 38 Special. This was a very, very simple, smooth shooting caliber. And so in that regard, it was very, very nice to shoot. I think the 32 cartridge, unfortunately, that was its kind of demise, was that it was a very almost anemic cartridge, and law enforcement using this in the 1900s did not find it to be effective. And essentially, that's how the 38 Special cartridge came into play anyways, because law enforcement at that time was the primary user of firearms, felt they needed a more capable cartridge, and hence the 38 Special comes along. But again, just coming back once again to the 32 Smith & Wesson long, it was a really, really nice cartridge. It's fun to shoot. Currently, it's not cheap. In fact, it's probably one of the more expensive calibers to fire, at least from what I've found. I'm hoping that I can find more ammunition. First of all, it's a little difficult to find it. and second of all, it's pretty expensive. But it was still very, very enjoyable to shoot. And I think if you're interested in Smith & Wesson revolvers and have some other revolvers like I do, and maybe looking for something just a little different and bringing maybe your collection or the history up a little bit, this 32 Smith & Wesson long cartridge was kind of checked the box. It was just a nice addition to add to the collection, and I'm really glad I own it. It's a very, very pretty firearm. This particular example also was, I think, in very, very good condition, actually better than my Chief Special. The bluing seemed really, really good all the way across. I don't know if this is the original side plate. I've noticed that looks a little different there. Shop owner didn't know. It has a little bit different look, as you can see, than this particular Chief Special, but I don't know enough about the 30s and the 30-1s, if this was maybe even commonplace or what have you. But beyond that, the firearm shot perfectly. It's in very, very good condition otherwise, and it was very enjoyable. So I hope you guys like that. Hope you enjoyed another revolver segment. They're just so fun to kind of talk about and go back in time or history and kind of relive some of the Smith & Wesson history. It's just kind of a treat and enjoyable. And again, it was very enjoyable to shoot. So thanks for tuning into the Daily Defender, and we'll see you again very soon.